This week I'm taking a question from Brent Mattis, who wanted to know my opinion of the fact that rationalists, or aspiring rationalists, are much more inclined to dispense with social convention and tradition, both in their own lives and in their ideas about how society in general should work. This is indeed something that I've noticed. In my own experience, people who are especially serious about studying rationality and about trying to make themselves more rational are also much more likely to question the value of really fundamental societal institutions and ways of doing things, like marriage or monogamy or the nuclear family household or traditional gender roles or having children. And in one sense, this isn't surprising. A big part of rationality is really asking yourself, what are my goals for myself and for the world, and how can I best achieve them, rather than just sticking to whatever the default is for the people around you or the custom in your particular community or culture. So it's not surprising then that you would end up diverging from the standard more often than people who aren't even asking themselves those questions. But what Brent suggested that I thought was so interesting, and why I wanted to take this topic for my video blog, is that he thinks that rationalists can tend to err too much on the side of abandoning convention, and that their thinking is essentially, well, just because we've done something a certain way in the past is no reason to keep doing it that way in the future. And that the correct way of thinking, Brent suggested, is that the fact that things have been done a certain way in the past is actually some evidence that that's a better way to do things. And this argument essentially is akin to the effects of natural selection in evolution, where you have traits and behaviors that are beneficial to your genes and therefore stick around and spread, or if they're not, they don't. So, for example, incest leads to genetic defects. So the trait of having an aversion to hooking up with your family members is incredibly adaptive and spread to the point of being nearly universal. So an aversion to incest is advantageous to your genes, but you could also expect to see the same kind of phenomenon happening, the same kind of selection pressure for social customs that are advantageous to individuals or to social groups. There are some ways of organizing our lives and our relationships with each other that just work better than others, and so we would expect those to stick around and spread, and the ones that don't work as well to be abandoned. I think probably a poster child for this argument would be the fact that there are certain kinds of living arrangements that just work better than others, like the fact, or like the idea of having a small group of families, of extended families, or of people who know each other, sharing communal spaces for gathering and recreation. This is a pattern that you can see for millennia in lots of different areas of the world. And then in the mid-20th century, urban planners tried to dispense with that tradition in these big housing projects like Prodigo in Chicago, in which hundreds of families who didn't know each other were sharing communal spaces like stairways and corridors and courtyards. And it was a notorious disaster. The communal spaces fell quickly into disrepair because no one felt any particular sense of ownership over them. And they were incredibly unsafe because no one really recognized the other people in the spaces anyway, so you couldn't tell the intruders from the other residents. And the point is that Prodigo and the other housing project models seemed logical, and they seemed like they would be an improvement over the status quo, but they failed because planners ignored hundreds and hundreds of years of information about what models for living actually worked. So that's one argument. And then a related argument for caution in dispensing with tradition is the fact that human psychology and social psychology, social systems in general, are really complex systems. And if you're going to tinker with those systems without fully understanding, really understanding the function of the parts you're tinkering with and how they fit into the whole, you can easily end up with unexpected and negative results. So there's a great parable making this argument by a British essayist I like named G.K. Chesterton. So he asks you to imagine a gate or a fence erected across a road. And he says, the more modern type of reformer goes gaily up to it and says, "I don't see the use of this, let us clear it away." to which the more intelligent type of reformer will do well to answer, "If you don't see the use of it, I certainly won't let you clear it away. Go away and think. Then, when you can come back and tell me that you do see the use of it, I may allow you to destroy it." So his point is that whoever had built the fence built it because he thought that he had some reason for thinking it was a good idea for somebody, and until we fully understand that reason, we can't judge whether the reason is reasonable. So I think that both the selection pressure argument that Brent alluded to and the complex system argument that G.K. Chesterton made are both valuable points to keep in mind, but I also think that they have limited scope, and I'd like to counter them with a few arguments of my own. So first off, I think that Brent overestimates the strength of the selection pressure effect in social custom. That in the genetic context, you have a really strong pressure where behaviors that don't give you an advantage or that put you at a disadvantage will quickly die out and be replaced by other behaviors. Whereas in the setting of social customs, disadvantageous social customs, customs that are either not advantageous or actively harmful, can still be really sticky. And also in the context of genetics, you have this constant randomized mutation where new behaviors and new traits are being tried out all the time to see if they're any better than the ones currently in existence. And you don't necessarily have that kind of constant experimentation in the social realm. So I would expect the effect of selection pressure to be much weaker for social customs. Secondly, there's this really common bias called the status quo bias, in which people require a much greater standard of proof against the status quo than they do for the status quo, which leads to this stickiness, this friction in society. The status quo bias is why you see employees preferring their current healthcare plan or their current retirement plan over a new one that's clearly objectively better, just because the current one that they have, even though the only reason that they have their current plan is because it was the only one that was available to them when they first signed up. And I think that people who are interested in rationality are particularly attuned to the status quo bias, and they're aware of it, and they try to correct for it. So that's going to be one thing that's contributing to them being more willing to push the envelope than a typical person. And thirdly, I think that I know that there's a difference between policy or behavior that's good for your genes and a policy or behavior that's good for you as an individual and for your own happiness. So, for example, something like having children clearly is advantageous to your genes and is therefore going to spread and be a fundamental institution in human society. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for your own happiness as an individual. It just depends on your own preferences and personality and goals. And I think, again, that rationalists are much more attuned to that distinction between those two goals and much more inclined to ask themselves whether a tradition is actually good for them or just for their genes. So I think that the overall takeaway is that knowing nothing else, just knowing that something is a tradition, I agree that gives you some evidence that it is more beneficial than other policies, all else equal. I just think that the strength of that evidence is low, and I think that it also quickly becomes moot as you get more information about the origin and the function of that tradition, and ask yourself other questions, like, for example, how do my motivations and values match the motivations and values of the people who originally instituted this tradition? Or how does my situation now, or the situation that society is in now, compare to the situation that was in play when this tradition arose? So, for example, something like the taboo against promiscuity comes from a time which characterized most of human history where there was no reliable and widely available birth control. So the fact that there is now radically changes the situation and dramatically weakens the case for continuing that tradition. And finally, I think you should ask yourself, how risk-averse are you? Because something like G.K. Chesterton's rule is basically that if you can't be extremely confident that you know what the effects of tinkering with tradition are going to be, then you just should play it safe and not do it. And obviously some level of risk aversion is good when you're talking about your own life or the health of society, but it's one factor to be weighed against other factors like the costs of the current tradition or the expected benefits of changing it. And finally, I'd like to make a more holistic argument about risk, which is that even if it's disadvantageous for you personally or for a particular social group to try a new way of structuring their lives or their relationships or a new kind of diet, it's actually much better for all of us overall if people are willing to do that kind of experimentation with social norms. Because that's how we get evidence. That's how we get information about what works and what doesn't. The more people willing to try out new ways of structuring their lives and their societies, the better we all end up in the long run.